Hi all, welcome. As you're coming in, we'll get started here on our Water with Your Lunch webinar in about a minute, letting people file in and find their seats. Welcome everyone who's joining us. We'll get started here in just a minute. Thanks so much for being a part of our Water with Your Lunch. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to Know Your Snow, Water with Your Lunch 2023. My name is Lindsay DeFreitas. I'm the Public Relations and Media Specialist with the Colorado River District. And I am very excited to welcome today two experts in snow and water, maybe even a little bit of forecasting. We have Brian Lazar, the Deputy Director with the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. And according to what we know about Brian, he's been here since the mid-90s working with snow and climates on both sides of the equator, and as a mountain guide and an avalanche educator, curriculum developer, former executive director with the American Institute for Avalanche Research and Education, and a member of the American Avalanche Association Education Committee. He has a master's in engineering studying snow and ice mechanics in Alaska's Chugach Range. And he's worked for many years as a consultant investigating snowpack runoff and potential changes to seasonal snowpack as a result of climate change. And Brian currently lives in Carbondale with his wife and two kids, so he's just down the road from us as we are based in Glenwood. After Brian gives us a look at the snow of the year, we're going to hear from Paul Miller, who is the Service Coordination Hydrologist with the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. Paul has been there for about 9 years, and before he joined the CBRFC, he worked for the Bureau of Reclamation in the Boulder Canyon Operations Office for 7 years, receiving his PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he studied the impacts of climate change to the Colorado River Basin, in part through the use of the CBRFC hydrologic models and projected temperatures and precipitation data sets. So you can see that we have a lot of experts here with us today, and a little bit more about how our webinar is going to run. As we cover all of this information, there's a lot to learn and you may have questions. Please make sure to enter those questions into the Q&A feature instead of directly into the chat, and we will have about 20 minutes at the end of our presentations to address those questions. So make sure to enter them, but you might not hear them addressed right away. We are going to get to them after the program. And we're looking forward to about an hour, maybe 45 minutes of presentations and informations before we get to that point. So we are here to talk about snow. But before we get to that, I'm going to do a short introduction about my organization. We are the Colorado River District, and we're hosting you today with one of our Water with Your Lunch webinar series. Usually we have about 4 in a year, covering all kinds of local information or regional concerns related to water. And the organization itself was founded in about 1937 when local ranchers and farmers here on the western slope of Colorado read in the newspaper that more water was going to be diverted from the headwaters of the Colorado River over to the growing populations on the Front Range. And we recognized then that there was no way we were going to compete in numbers or economic impact with those urban areas. So we decided to band together and were formed by a state charter in 1937 with the mission that you see in front of you to protect West Slope water users and to safeguard the water for Colorado, to which the state is entitled. So we have that two-part mission. A lot of what we do is very local. We work with people in our 15 county region. I'm going to show you the map here so you can get a sense of what that looks like. Here we are in the light blue. These 15 counties that we represent encompass the headwaters of the Colorado River in the state of Colorado. So you can see the Yampa white-green drainage basin in the top there. the main stem of the Colorado running all the way from Grand County to the border of Utah. And then in the lower part of our district, the Gunnison and the Uncompahgre rivers, which also join the Colorado right before they exit the state. So while we have a tremendous amount of land in our district and a tremendous amount of water, our population has never been able to compete with the overall state. We're about 9% of the state's population in these 15 counties, but we create, or the snow outside of my window right now, generates about 65% of the natural flows of the Colorado River at Lee Ferry. So you can see that right down in the middle there. And if you add our sister district, the Southwest Conservation District, that amount of water is actually closer to 70%. So the rest of this map, if we take a quick look at it, because right now the context of the entire Colorado River Basin is very important to establish why we're talking about snowpack, why we're here discussing the ins and outs and how much we can expect to see in the rivers. So the black lines indicate the Colorado River Basin. You can see it tracing all the way through the 7 states, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, and California. And everything within those black lines is inside of the basin. All of those areas depend on the Colorado River. Outside, we also have some very large areas and large population centers that also depend on the river. Gray areas indicate any urban area that depends on water from these rivers, but falls outside of the natural boundaries of the river basin. So we're relying on trans-basin diversions outside the basin to support areas on Colorado Front Range, around Salt Lake City and the Wasatch Front, the metroplexes of San Diego and Las Vegas down in California, and then also the central urban areas in New Mexico. All told, this river basin supports about 40 million people and has a massive economic impact and on the health of the economy in the country as a whole. And yet we are in the headlines all the time right now with drought and crisis and storage struggles. And we just want to look a little bit about why that is, again, just to tee up the information that you're about to get from our experts. So one thing to keep in mind is that as we move into this hotter, drier future and climate change impacts us directly here in the basin, for every 1 degree of Fahrenheit rise in temperature, that's average annual temperature, stream flow can be reduced anywhere from 3% to 9%, with a lot of recent studies indicating that we are closer to the 9%. And that impacts us directly because with that many people depending on the river, that many people continuing to draw out of the waters and to develop and to live their lives, basically, we are working with less water than there was originally on paper when these states were first developed and founded. So this slide is a really, really quick overview of why you might have been hearing a lot about the Colorado River and the drought. And right now we're looking outside at another beautiful snowstorm coming through. And you're saying, oh, well, we got lots of snow, it's above average. Why are we still worried about droughts? And that's the thing. We need to make sure we're understanding there's a difference between drought and storage. So right now, when we see soil moisture that's in good shape and rivers that might actually flow this summer, and we say, is the drought over? Well, yes and no. Right now, you can see that the system storage, and that includes these major reservoirs all throughout the basin, is very, very low. Lake Powell being the lowest at 22% full, and below some of those target protected elevations that we need to ensure the health of the infrastructure of Glen Canyon Dam and the hydropower that is generated from it. And Lake Mead, of course, is also quite low. And if you are someone joining us from the Gunnison Basin, I don't have to tell you that Blue Mesa Reservoir doesn't look like it used to. So this comes from 20 years of drought and systemic overuse throughout the entire basin. And I don't think that we're going to see anything get fixed by one single year of good snow. Another impact besides just drought and climate change is going to be the fact that people really do love to come live where it is sunny. So the amount of water that was on paper when these states were founded and the cities drew their diversions and the agriculturalists decided how much water they needed to run their farms, our population has exploded since then. So currently, that's the growth you're seeing on the screen. Currently, Colorado is at about 5.5 million people. And while the projected future population increase, the rate of increase has actually gone down recently. We're looking still at another 2 million people just within the state. And the Colorado River Basin as a whole continuing to grow from about 40 million people today, or a little bit over, all the way up to possibly 76 million people in 2060. And just looking at those numbers and thinking about the map that we just saw, remember that our district, our 15 counties here in the headwater counties, 65% of the natural flow of the Colorado River is going to come from the snow that we're talking about today. So really the conversation couldn't be any more critical. And I know for some of the recreationists who might be in the room today, you just want to hear, like, is it going to be good? Is it going to stay good? And those of us who are hoping to get some good river permits for the summer, who might not have gotten the ones that we wanted already, are wondering what the rivers are going to look like. And that is also a critical question, because a tremendous amount of our economy on the Western Slope does depend on a healthy tourism and recreation economy. And so much of that is based around river and snow. So there's a lot to talk about today. But I also just don't want to leave you with the thought that the Colorado River District only talks about doom and gloom and that nothing is going very well, because we do have a lot of bright points in our conversation. I just have to make this quick plug for our grant program, which is called the Community Funding Partnership Grant. It was approved in 2020 by ballot measure 7A, which passed with tremendous bipartisan support throughout districts that often don't agree with each other on much else. So that alone is encouraging. We are all on the same page when it comes to water. And in the 2 years since this partnership program has been running, we've funded more than 70 projects now, and over $6 million of that grant has moved out the door and into the hands of the people who are coming up with solutions on the ground, whether it is irrigation efficiency, whether it is infrastructure upgrades for towns, or any of the projects that are looking into the future and asking, how can we live in this hotter, drier future? What do solutions look like for myself and for my community? So we not only have been able to help fund these projects, but we've been timed very well, because with recent access to federal funding, also state funding and private opportunities, our nimble grant program has been able to leverage those federal dollars back into our community. Close to $50 million of that money has come to our small district. And we're very proud of that. And it's not us, really. We're sort of the conduit making it happen. But the people who are coming up with the solutions are the constituents, are our water users. And it's all across the basin, and it's all across different water use groups. It's not just agriculturalists or recreationists. It's not just environmental groups or municipalities. We are able to work with all of those people on a daily basis to make sure that we are meeting that first part of our mission, which is to support the water users on the Western Slope. So that is a really short overview of what my organization does. I really encourage you to visit our social channels listed here. If you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, we do have a bi-weekly roundup of water news headlines that I put together every Monday and Thursday. And it's not really a lot of our messaging, although you'll hear about our events there. It's just a great way to stay involved in the conversation. And I do try to put the important ones on the top. So if you get a little bit overwhelmed by how much these conversations are showing up in the media, you can just kind of stick to the top few there. And then finally, we are starting our State of the River season. We are going to have 9 events throughout the basin, throughout our 15 counties, where you can come in person at no cost and hear a little bit more about what we're doing in your community, and also to advocate for the health of the river as a whole. So that's a look at the Colorado River District. And I'm going to queue up Brian if he can come online here. And he's going to talk a little bit about the health of the snowpack across our district and how it compares to the past. And Brian, I'll stop talking and let you take it from here. Thanks.
No, that was really interesting, Lindsay. I learned a bunch. Let's see, I think I need you to stop sharing so I can share mine, and then I'll swap over. And how's that look? You guys seeing the main screen now?
That looks good. We're seeing the right one.
All right. Well, great. So as Lindsay mentioned in my bio, I do have a bit of a background as a working hydrologist. I spent kind of 6 years doing environmental consulting, and I did spend a lot of time doing snowpack runoff, because as we all know, a good chunk, 80% or so of our water resources comes from snowmelt in large portions of the Western US. But in the last 13 years, I've been working as the deputy director of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, And in that role, I'm less worried about water resources at a professional level. I'm certainly worried about it on a personal level. And I worry about how the snowpack structure stacks up over time, because it can produce avalanches. And that's my main job now, is forecasting avalanches, both for the backcountry and backcountry recreationalists, which is the forward-facing part of our operation. The other half of our operation is forecasting and doing mitigation work, which usually means using explosives to trigger avalanches when and where we want them, so that we can open the state's transportation corridors and highways safely. So those are kind of the two pieces of our operation, and I'm happy to answer questions more about avalanches and the Colorado Avalanche Information Center when we're done here. So I wanted to start, we're having a pretty good year in terms of snowpack. We are in the midst of a fairly potent winter storm right now, and this is a model simulation, which is actually capturing the recent snowfall from just Tuesday and Wednesday right now. 2-kilometer high resolution WRF model. Those red areas are approaching a foot of snow. And those pink areas down in the San Juans here are approaching 2 feet of snow. And so this is why we have an avalanche warning in place down in the San Juans as of today. You can see here, we also had some areas over a foot of snow on the Uncompahgre Plateau, across the Grand Mesa, and across the western portions of our Elk Mountains, from west of Crested Butte in the Anthracite Range, north through the Ruby Range, over Schofield Pass, through Marble, and the Ragged Range. So a pretty good, healthy storm system, which is great. And this is one of many that we've seen this year, which puts us, as of today, in pretty good shape. So this is kind of by basin. You can see that we are above normal or long-term median. You can see here the median for the SNOTEL sites runs from 1991 through 2020, and this was updated on the decade. So they're kind of 30-year running medians, and we are in healthy territory, all except kind of the headwaters of the Arkansas River. And anyone who lives up near kind of Leadville, down the Ark Valley through Buena Vista and Salida knows they've missed out on a lot of the storm system, and that's reflected in the snow water equivalent on the ground. And that's how we talk about snowpack, both as hydrologists and for us as avalanche forecasters. We also talk about snow in terms of snow water equivalent, which is just the amount of water in a snowpack it would be if you melted it all. And the reason we talk about snow water equivalent for as hydrologists, I'm going to leave to Paul. But for avalanche forecasting, we are often worried about the snowpack structure, weak layers buried in the snowpack. And so we are interested in the load. And as you all know, a foot of really dense, heavy kind of Sierra cement type snow weighs a lot more than a foot of really cold blower powder. And so the way for us to normalize loading on weak layers within the snowpack is to talk about it in terms of snow water equivalent. There is some skepticism among some of our colleagues that the South Platte is actually sitting at 105, and that has to do because of some of the distribution and locations of the SNOTEL sites. But even along these front ranges here, even if we're a little bit under long-term median, we're still in pretty good shape. So this is just another map which is showing all of those basins. You can see that the river basins, of course, do not obey state lines. And so things like the Yampa, White Little Snake Basin up here, of course, has headwaters up in Wyoming. And some of our water basins down in the San Miguel area extend into New Mexico and parts of Arizona. And then all of these circles are the individual SNOTEL stations from which this data is accrued. And you can see that these blue areas, anything in the light blue is putting us, at 110 to 129%. And these dark purple areas are over 150. So in my neck of the woods here, like around the Schofield Pass and the divide between the Gunnison and the Colorado headwaters, we've got certain stations which are sitting at over 150% of long-term median, as well as down in the San Juan Mountains. And this is as of March 1st, so this is not accounting for the snowfall that's falling today. You can see here what I was talking about with the South Platte is that we do have quite a number of southerly stations that are sitting below the 30-year median. But up north, we've been doing better. And this has been reflected kind of in a lot of the storm patterns we've been seeing, where we're seeing the Park Range here, kind of north of Steamboat, doing quite well on some of these northerly flows, and that has been hitting areas around Cameron Pass red feather lakes, and the southern areas have missed out a little bit. So it's quite possible that the South Platte is a little optimistic in that projection. But again, by and large, doing quite well. And that's both in river basins and throughout many of the stations scattered throughout the state. When we talk about avalanche forecasting and we talk about snowpacks on the ground, we also look at other data. We get a lot of snowpack measurements from our transportation corridors because we put out storm boards, and we have a network of remote weather stations around the state, which are measuring things like snow water equivalent, height of new snow, snow depth, and we can use that data to interpolate into snowpack depth maps. Plus, we ingest all of the data that we get from professional operations like the ski areas and things like that, which are often measuring snow in places that aren't as interesting to hydrologists. And the ski areas, by and large, are doing quite well too, and most of them are running along above their long-term average snowfall for this time of the year. It's just March 1st. We've had several ski areas in these blue areas, western side of the states, definitely been favored by our storm tracks this year. And so we've got many of our ski areas throughout the state of Colorado that have crested 300 inches of snowfall as early as March 1st. And that's often a season total for many ski areas. So this is the snow water equivalent, all the basins taken together. So you can see on a statewide average, we're 123% of our median. That number becomes more important the deeper into the season we get. And so it's very easy to get misled by some of these numbers. If you're talking about we're only 10% of average or we're 300% of average when we're in the very early part of the season at the tail ends, or at the very late part of the season. So we had a really big snow year in the water year of 2019. And we talk about water or avalanche years the same way we talk about water years, and that the year begins on October 1st and it ends on September 30th of the following year. So this is avalanche and water year 2023. So in our avalanche and water year of 2019, we actually were quite a bit snowy as well. And I remember getting into mid to late June and people were saying, oh my gosh, we have 1,000% of average water. But you got to remember, when you're talking about very tiny values, 1,000% could be the difference between 1 inch on the ground and 3 inches on the ground. So when it really matters is how are we looking right at the peak of our snowmelt curve, which has historically taken place around, it's historically been measured on April 1st. There is some debate as to whether or not April 1st is still the date to be measuring that, as we see the shape of our snow water equivalent curves change in the face of climate change. But if we take our peak, that's represented by this green X here, that is our median peak. And we are, as of March 1st, 94% of our median peak, and we still have 5 weeks to go. So as long as we stay in this fairly progressive weather pattern, which is looking good, at least in the near term. So for us as avalanche forecasters, we are very much focused on near-term weather forecasting, which is essentially the next week to 10 days. The long-term seasonal forecast is not really in our purview. Plus, they have fairly low skill scores. But for at least the next week or two, we look to stay in a fairly progressive pattern. And so there's no reason to expect that this black line would decline anytime soon. So this purple line is our max snow water equivalent throughout the state of Colorado on every given day. So that does not represent a year. That represents the max value of every day of the year strung together. So that would be the deepest, fattest snow year you could ever imagine. Similarly, the red line takes the minimum value of snow water equivalent on the ground for every day of the year and strings together that time series. And the green line represents our long-term median, which is why it's so smooth, because it's averaging over 30 years. So you can see here, we got off to a pretty good start. We started building up snow in October. My birthday's on October 29th, and I was skiing already by October 29th, at least west of my house here. And you can see we've tracked near the long-term median until we got into the last part of December, when our Christmas storms arrived. That brought pretty healthy snowfall to most of the state. That crested us above our long-term median, and we have stayed there ever since. And we've just continued to depart from our long-term median without very many dry spells. It has been a pretty snowy winter. As Lindsay mentioned, a lot of people love Colorado because we've had a lot of sunshine. There's been less sunshine this winter than many past winters. For those of us who love snow, that's been awesome because we haven't had big dry spells. We haven't had breaks in the snowpack. And from an avalanche perspective, dry spells are what produce weak layers for us. And so when we have snowy periods interrupted by prolonged dry spells like we did last year, those lead to pretty bad avalanche conditions. So for comparison, I kept this green line here. The light green line is the long-term median. The black line is us this year, so water year 2023. This was last year, or water year 2022, and you can see how this blue line got really flat through January. And for those of you who are around Colorado, remember we had a month plus drought throughout January, which made for some really nice riding conditions, plenty of sunshine, but you can see what that did to our snow water equivalent curve last year. And at the same time this year, we did not see a drought, and so things just kept climbing, and they're looking similar to what happened in March of 2019. So we have more snow on the ground than we did during March of 2019. This very steep rise here is what marked a historic period of snowfall and our historic avalanche cycle. So those of you who were around in March of 2019, remember we had widespread historic size avalanches across most of the state. So we had a very strong snowpack, but then it was 12 days of continued heavy snowfall. And so we dropped the equivalent of a foot of water, or snow water equivalent. And so if you just did the quick math, and multiply that by 10 as a rough guess, you're looking at, 10 to 12 feet of snow in a 12-day period. This was enough to break those weak layers near the ground and led to that historic avalanche cycle, which made the news. It was closing I-70, breaking trees, extending historic avalanche paths. So I get asked a lot this year, hey, are we in a setup that we could see something like March of 2019? And I said, sure, we've got a deep and we've got a strong snowpack, but what's yet to see is, do we have a loading event in the cards like what we saw in March of 2019? The bets are certainly against that. It's unusual to get 10 to 15 feet of snow in a 12-day period, but who knows? Storms are becoming a little bit harder to predict, essentially the duration and the intensity of some of these storms in the light of climate change. So I would not rule it out. This is the period I was talking about in early June. So you can see the long-term average and the curve at the tail end of June 2019 was sitting at like 1,000, 2,000% of normal. But again, that's not as meaningful as if that was happening at the peak. So down here, it was mid-June. So normally you've got a couple inches, you can see on the y-axis here, of snow water equivalent on the ground. So if you had, if you're talking about 1/2 inch to 5 inches of snow on the ground, you've got, quite a dramatic change in the percentage from normal. So what we're really looking at is, how do we compare to normal right at the top of this curve? So here's what this means in terms of snowpack depth on the ground. This is estimated for tomorrow. Most of the data that goes into this modeled snow depth forecast is already baked in. So we're really just forecasting for the storm that's going on right now. And it's playing out largely as forecast. You can see here, we've got how much depth we've got on the ground. And you can see in these dark blue areas, so Cumberland-Slaminga Pass, down in the very southeast of the San Juans, which was unfortunately the site of an avalanche fatality a few days ago. The Wolf Creek Pass area, large swaths along the divide in the San Juan Mountains. Here is our neck of the woods, right here in the western portion of the Elk Mountains. So you can see these deep incised valleys here, which are just east of the deep area. That's where Aspen and the Aspen ski areas are located. Crested Butte would be just down in here. So just to our west, that's the Anthracite Range, the Ruby Range, the Ragged Range. We've got snow depth on the ground over 100 inches. And in some places we're approaching almost 12 feet of snow on the ground. So, Colorado is typically a fairly dry and thin snowpack, but we do have these areas that are now over 100. We've got areas in the flat tops. We just had a mitigation mission on Grand Mesa today and measured 102 inches on the ground at Skyway Point. And then, of course, the Park Range north of Steamboat, the snowiest spot historically in the state. And we are pushing 140 inches in some places near the Tower Snowtell site. And so this has really been a tale of kind of two snowpacks throughout Colorado. In these deeper purple areas, we're really just worried about storm snow instabilities because the weak layers that are deep in the snowpack are so deep, we can't really impact them as people. As you move east into Summit, Eagle County, and all this stuff like the Sangre de Cristos, we've got much thinner snowpack. And here, the weak layers near the ground are still very much in play. And so we're seeing avalanches break on those. So this is just an animation of total snow depth over Colorado throughout the season. You'll see the ticker up here starting in October. And what's of note here is as this image, this animation plays through, is that we have almost no dry spells. You didn't see any flat lines in the snow water equivalent curves. We had very few breaks of more than a few days without snowfall lasting right up through today. And so it's been a remarkably snowy period. And I'm getting asked the same question that Lindsay's getting asked is, oh, does this mean the drought is over? And without treading onto Paul's turf too much, it's, we've had 2 decades of drought. So 2 decades of seasons like this might balance things out, but 1 year, probably not. And so what are we looking at going forward? And so what I have here in the green line is our long-term median. Black line is real data up to here. And then these are projections going forward. So this is the maximum projection in the purple, minimum projection down here. And then this is the 10% probability for low. This is 90%. So these are unlikely to hit the red, unlikely to hit the purple. But these 3 green lines in the middle, which kind of represent 30, 50, and 70%, all put us above long-term median even until we get down into the later stages of the melt. So the long-term projections for this season are looking fairly good for us. What this looks like in terms of snowpack on the ground, this is what we track. And we were very much worried about snowpack structure. As a hydrologist, less worried about snowpack structure and more just about how much water is in that snowpack. What we do are track storm events and weak layers which form in between those storm events. This was our one pronounced drought of the season. We had right before Thanksgiving, we had about a 2-week period of no snow. That produced a fairly thick and reactive weak layer. We're still seeing avalanches break on this weak layer near the ground in the thinner snowpack areas. In places that have more than about 6 feet of snow on the ground, this weak layer is now out of reach. And we are more worried about some weak layers that formed in our small little dry spell that took place just around Valentine's Day. And we date these weak layers by the date they are buried. Snowfall returned on Valentine's. And so these are our Valentine's Day facets, which is just another way of saying weak layer. And so we are seeing some avalanches break essentially 1 to 3 feet deep on those weak layers right now. These are the kinds of avalanches we're warning about right now with the ongoing storm, which are wind drifted slabs. This was in East Snowmass Creek just a couple of days ago. Fortunately, this gentleman was able to not get buried, rode this fairly small avalanche on the surface, did not get washed in the trees, and walked away safely. So we're thankful for that. But now that we've added, at least in the West Elks here and parts of the San Juan, 1 to 2 feet, we can expect avalanches like this to be quite a bit bigger over the next few days. And that's all I've got. And I will turn it over to Paul for the time being. And I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Brian, thanks so much. That was just right. That's what we needed to get a good picture of it. And then Paul's going to show us where it might be headed.
Sure. Let me figure out how to share my screen again. All right, here we go. Share screen. There we go. Share. Okay, slideshow. All right. Hopefully you all can see my screen in slideshow mode, and hopefully you all can hear me. So thanks everybody, and thanks Lindsay and the Colorado River District for having us here. I think I presented to you all last year, but I wanted to present something a little bit different. So you might see a couple slides that are very similar, but I also wanted to show some new stuff because it's a new year. And definitely a different year than I last presented to you all. So just a quick overview of who we are at the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. And like Brian was just showing, it's been a good snow year, but what does that mean for our forecast and for our water supply? And then I wanted to talk about a little bit about how confident we are in these forecasts, and then show a couple other interesting things that I thought you all might be interested in. So just the takeaway from my presentation is that here at the CBRC, we're all about decision support. We're all about listening to our stakeholders and doing what you guys need to do, doing what you guys want us to do so that you can do what you need to do as best as you possibly can. So we provide water supply forecasts. These are the forecasts that I'll show later on in this presentation. These are the seasonal volumetric water supply forecasts that many of our stakeholders like the Bureau of Reclamation rely on. We also do short-term forecasts. We also do peak flow forecasts, which this year are actually going to be really interesting. Our peak flow forecasts the last couple of years have been very boring. We also provide weather summaries and we do recreational reports, but we're constantly working to improve these services. So if you have any comments or suggestions, I'll share my email address at the end. Definitely let me know and we'll do what we can. So at the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, we're located out in Salt Lake City, Utah. So I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not, but I'm guessing most of you know where Salt Lake City is. But we're one of 13 RFCs nationwide, and we work with a subset of the 122 weather forecast offices that are part of the National Weather Service. But we're all about supporting NOAA's hydrologic services and products. And in the western part of the US, we're really focused on water supply services. If you go out to the east, those river forecast centers aren't providing water supply forecasts. They're more concerned with flooding. They have hurricane events. They have all kinds of stuff that they are providing support for. But water supply tends not to be one of their major focuses. In the West, it is like our major focus in our office, and definitely our most popular products are water supply related. So like I mentioned, we provide streamflow and water supply forecasts. This is a map of current conditions at our water supply points. We provide monthly water supply forecasts at 174 locations. These are all seasonal forecasts. It's typically over the April through July period, but in the lower Colorado River Basin, that period changes just a little bit just because the snow doesn't typically melt over April through July. So we have some January through June and some other delineations down there. But we also make daily streamflow forecasts at 460 locations. And these typically look out 10 days. We do have some locations that go out as far as 15 days. And that's your best source of information for looking at real water on the ground. If you're concerned about flooding, anything like that, we're typically working really closely with our weather forecast office partners. They're the ones that are going to buzz your phone and say, hey, there's a flash flood going on. Hey, watch out for these flooding events. We're working with those offices to let them know how high we think the flooding is going to go, how long we think the flooding is going to go. So they're the ones pushing those watches and warnings out to you, and we're the ones providing them with that support so that they can get the information out to emergency managers and other folks. So how do we do what we do? This is way overcomplicated, but just in case you're interested, we use a continuous conceptual lumped model. We call it the Sacramento Soil Moisture Accounting Model. It's coupled with a snow model called Snow 17. I don't think there's anything fancy about the 17 other than it's the 17th version of that model. But basically, what I want to get across here is that our model is relatively simplistic, and that's not to say that it's not robust. It takes into account parameterized soil moisture conditions. So we take into account the dry soils that we've been seeing. We model evapotranspiration. We model surface runoff. We model the rain that's coming in. Is it snow? Is it rain? All that kind of stuff. So we work with this model every day. We look at it at least once a day, if not more frequently. Definitely during the runoff period, it's a more frequent thing. But we can make lots of changes to this as forecasters. We can interact with the model. It's not like a push, play, walk away kind of thing. It's a push, play. Let's really dig into what are these numbers telling us? What are these numbers showing us? Is it the best that we can do? And we interact very heavily with this model. So we're taking a really close look at it every day. And if you ever happen to be in Salt Lake City and want to come by our office and see how the magic is made, you're more than welcome to. So, we take this data and we bring in lots of observed data. We are definitely data consumers. We're not out there getting the measurements. That belongs to the heroes of the USGS, and Colorado's got its own stream gauge network, which is awesome and that we use. The Natural Resources Conservation Service with their SNOTEL network, all the reservoir operators that we get information from. That is all extremely valuable information that we feed our model. We get lots of forecasted operational data from a lot of those reservoir operators, and then we get forecast information from the weather forecast offices and other parts of NOAA. We also do a lot of modeling. Like I mentioned, soil moisture is a big part of what we do. We don't directly use any soil moisture measurements, even though there is soil moisture data out there. It doesn't always correspond exactly with what we're trying to model in our model. So we do a lot of that soil moisture monitoring. And then we interact with the model daily. And I stole this Lego vignette from the Park Service during COVID times, but we can even work remotely with our model. So it's been nice because we've been able to take our laptops to our stakeholders and show them exactly what we do, which is something we weren't able to do before COVID and the advancements in remote work happened. So this is typically what we're looking at, and this is the Green River, near Green River, Utah. Sorry, I'm choking a little bit. But typically what we're looking at here is to the left of this red line is the past. So we're typically looking at the past 10 days of output from our model and seeing how that correlates with observed data from the USGS or whoever happens to be providing the observed data over a particular reach of river. And you can see here at this data point, at this instant, our model is capturing the observed conditions really well. Here, those red dots are the observations and the blue line is the model simulation. And then that gives us a lot of confidence that looking out over the next 10 days, that our forecast has some degree of confidence and accuracy to it. So you can see in this particular example, we were expecting a warm up here at the beginning of May 2017. And we were thinking that the snow was going to start to melt and those flows were about to start rising. So that's typically what we're looking at. This is what we're looking at each of those 470 locations every day. This is kind of the view that we have. So how do we come up with these seasonal forecasts? How do we come up with an April through July volume at those water supply forecast points? Well, what we do is we take that model and we look and we try and make sure that we're modeling things as best as we possibly can. So hopefully things are looking like that past graphic that I showed you. The observations are lining up really well with our model. We're very confident in how much snow is being modeled in our model. It's matching up with the observations on the ground and in satellites in some cases that we're getting. And so we try and get our model to represent conditions as best as they possibly can every day. And then every day what we do is we cycle through precipitation and temperature traces from 1991 through 2020, all the way. We actually go out a year, but for the sake of this, let's just say we're going out to the end of July for our April through July forecast. So for instance, today, Tracy was sitting at the desk. He got the model representing things as best as he possibly could. And we decided to go through precipitation and temperature traces from 1991 all the way through 2020. And so we come up with these 30 possible hydrologic futures. And from there, we can sum up the April through July runoff. So how are we doing this year? So just looking back at the past fall soil moisture conditions, we were very dry heading into this year. And so our soil moisture conditions were very dry. That typically means we have a less efficient runoff. And we typically look at these conditions in the fall because irrigation season is over and the gauges haven't frozen over yet. But like Brian was showing, basin-wide snowpack has been really great. We're kind of hovering around 130% in a lot of areas in the upper Colorado River Basin. A lot of snow tells are reporting snow water equivalent amounts in the top 5 to 10 of their historical record. And the really cool thing is that usually we aren't hitting our normal peak. Our normal peak gets hit about April 1st, but we've hit that normal peak snow water equivalent about now. So we're right about at the peak of a normal year. So that's great because we're still trending upward and onward. So I just think that's a really cool point to make. So we published a lot of our results and put this on our website. It's cbrfc.noaa.gov, and you can cruise around it and check out what we have. But I wanted to show you and focus on our water supply forecast. And this is a shot from last year for Lake Powell, but I wanted to show you what the full graph looks like as we get through the end of July. And you can see last year was sad and dry. And so our forecast started close to normal. We got off to a good start last year, but then we had just historically dry January and February. You can kind of see how our forecast trended down. And eventually we settled at about 60% of average. And you can just see this orange line is what we ended up seeing. The green line is average conditions. We were well below that. This year is a much different story. So this year, we started off forecasting close to average, and then the snow has just kept coming, which has been great. And you've kind of seen this blue line. This blue line is our raw day-to-day forecast, and it's just kind of been trending upward, which is great. Our last official forecast was for 7.5 million acre feet of water heading into Lake Powell. That's just under 120% of average. I wanted to highlight this number here to the right. This is our raw ESP number. We're currently working to finalize our March forecast. I think it's going to be closer to this number, this 8 million acre feet number. So we could see somewhere in the neighborhood of 120% of average as our forecast, our official forecast number for March. That will hopefully we'll have it out by Friday, might bleed into next week a little bit, but that's what we're hoping for. So how confident are we in these forecasts? So we published our verification statistics on our website. And for most sites in Colorado, by the time we get to March, we're usually within about 15%. So that's great because even if things got really dry on the drier end of things, we wouldn't expect them to get too much drier. There's not as much variability here. So we're becoming more and more confident in our forecast, which makes sense as we get closer and closer to April. And for a lot of sites in Colorado, we do really, really well. And that's just because we have lots of data in Colorado and it's just a nice place to get information. Some parts, especially out in Utah, are a bit data sparse. We don't do as well there, but still not too bad. So kind of to Brian's point, what does this mean for the drought? Again, like Brian was saying, one good year isn't going to reverse the last 20 years worth of drought impacts that we've had. The latest reclamation projection that our forecasts help inform, it shows Lake Powell's elevation rising by about 32 feet by the end of the water year, which isn't nothing, but that's still only 32% full at Lake Powell. And I thought this was a really cool article out of Newsweek that came out a few weeks ago. But it's by Jennifer Pitt, who's the director of the National Audubon Society. She said to refill the Colorado River reservoirs, you would need 3 average years of snowfall without any water use. And I think that was a really good way of putting it. So something else I wanted to show you all, because Colorado is, there's actually like 4 river forecast centers that cover various parts of Colorado. If you go to our webpage, you can get all of our River Forecast Center products that are related to our area here in Western Colorado. But we've recently been working with our colleagues at the other River Forecast Centers. So now we have a single page, we call it the Western Water Supply Map. And you can get water supply forecasts for your entire state from all the River Forecast Centers, all in one spot. And we work with them to make the graphics look similar to ours. I think the forecast periods are a bit different. They're not April through July, but the graphics all look the same. And yeah, we work with them to ingest their data and have it all on one page. It's kind of a nice one-stop shop. So that's something new. So there's lots of other things that we're doing. We're working with the Colorado River Climate and Hydrology Work Group, and Colorado's interests are definitely being put out there, and we're working with them to help improve our forecasts and other projects. We're also partnering with several universities. University of Colorado at Boulder is one of the more prominent ones. And we're also working with the Bureau of Reclamation and other agencies on lots of other funded research efforts. So lots of cool things going on. So here's my contact info and our website, and probably breeze through that maybe a little too quickly just to make sure we have time for questions. But yeah, if you have any questions, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. Definitely like to talk with all of you.
Paul, thanks so much. Yeah, that was really helpful. I did appreciate the deep dive into how many different places you all draw data from for these kinds of models. And I think that on the outside, the layperson, that is completely overwhelming. And we mostly just think, oh, they're measuring snow at the snow sites and stuff. I think those are the ones most of us are familiar with. Could you talk a little bit more about, is the technology surrounding snow measurement or snow water equivalent, is that changing? Are there new technologies on the horizon? I know LiDAR, maybe you could touch on that a little bit. I'm not sure how deep you want to go, but just to kind of open the book a little bit into the future for those of us who are like, well, how are they measuring these? And then of course, if people have questions for Brian, he's still here as well. So think about those questions and get them in the Q&A while we kick it off with this.
Yeah, and that's a great question, because the area of snow measurement is exploding really among us. And the one that's in the news a lot and kind of utilizes that LiDAR data is the airborne snow observatory data. So there's the airborne snow observatory folks that are based out of California, but they do flights over the Colorado River Basin, including parts of Colorado. And then I could be wrong on this. Is it Denver Water that's helping to sponsor the Colorado Airborne Snow Measurement Program?
There's quite a few funding partners, and I think we've supported that as well.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. So that is a similar kind of effort, but just focused in on Colorado. And so we are working with both the ASO and the CAIC folks to ingest that data and see how it affects our forecasts. We do have some, I don't know what the right word is, some experimental type of data of products that we're sharing with the CAIC folks in particular, that show what our forecast would be if we ingest their data into our forecast. So I think the results have been really interesting, and we just kind of need to keep building up the data set so that we can make some more definitive conclusions. But I think it's definitely like this growing body of research right now. All these new ways of getting snow information, but we also bring in snow information from the MODIS satellite data set. And then there's a lot of research.
Can you talk a little bit about what that one is? I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with it. I'm sure there's a few others.
So the MODIS satellite is NASA's satellite that's kind of orbiting the Earth, and they send us pictures of the snow coverage, and they also send us pictures of the dust contamination on those snowpacks. So we look at the snow coverage data more qualitatively. We just kind of look at it to see if our model is basically in agreement of where there's snow and where there isn't snow. But the dust contamination we actually use to inform the melt rates in our model. So if we see like really dusty snow conditions, we can increase the melt rate in our model in response to that. So that satellite information has been really helpful. The MODIS satellite is, I was just sitting in on a presentation yesterday. The MODIS satellite only has a life expectancy out to 2025 at the longest. So there's a new satellite that's orbiting up there called the VIIRS satellite. And so we're transitioning to similar kind of data sets um, to keep that work going. So that's really cool.
That's a lot of coordination with some huge agencies too.
Exactly. And then we're
Um,
also working with a lot of university partners. The NOAA Knowledge at the University of Colorado is working. He's ingesting all of this data. So he's ingesting SNOTEL information and remotely sent snow information to come up with a gridded snow model data set approximation. So that's another data set that we're looking at. And then there's actually more data sets, but those are probably the more prominent ones that we've been looking at lately. But yeah, tons of stuff going on, and just how we measure snow, look at snow. Yeah, it's great and overwhelming, and it's exciting.
So I have a question for Brian on something that you brought up, Paul, and that was the dust on snow. And I was wondering if, Brian, could you pick up that discussion a little bit? Because I know we've been seeing these hot, windy, dry, early summers starting that are moving dust from the west over to our mountains. Can you talk a little bit about how that impacts us?
Yeah, so and we just had our kind of our first measurable dust event with the last wind event from last week. So we started to see some snow show up in our snowpack on portions of Grand Mesa and the San Juan Mountains. And it does a couple things. So when dust becomes visible to the sky, it's a much reduced albedo. So essentially you're absorbing a lot more incoming solar radiation, and that will increase melt rates when dust is on the surface of the snow. So dust on snow has a lot of hydrologic implications. It can, although not always, have implications for avalanches. So when you have dust on the surface of the snow, it will heat up much more rapidly because of that lower albedo than the bright white snow. If you then bury that warm layer with cold, dry snow on top, you can get the formation of weak layers of snow right at that interface. If the dust comes in mid-storm and is buried immediately, you will not see that happen, which is thankfully what happened here last week. The dust needs to be on the surface, warm up, then get buried by dry snow. But then what we see in the spring oftentimes is the snowpack will melt, and you'll have a change in riding conditions for skiers, snowmobilers, things like that, as soon as the dust surfaces, because it really increases melt, and then it creates all kinds of really funky melting patterns. And so a lot of the dust on snow is driving these steep melt curves that you're seeing on snow water equivalent graphs, which we just didn't see as much 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, I was going to say that is a shift that's really impacted, especially for water storage. It's not melting at a steady rate. We're seeing the precipitous decline as it heats up, and I think that has taken a lot of us by surprise, because some of the management paradigms that we're familiar with just didn't play out. Meaning, when do you fill your reservoirs? How can you expect to get that water to irrigators later in the summer? Things like that. And then on the rivers, I know recreationists sometimes have noticed that these high water seasons are just happening earlier and earlier. Paul, do you see that happening this year? Do you have any crystal ball into the next few months of climate and temperature?
No, and that's one area of active research that we can't wait to see advance, because we have really good models that go out to the next 7 to 10 days for precipitation and temperature forecasts. And we have great climate models that show us decadal changes and longer. But this what we call the subseasonal period, that 2 week and out to 2 years about, that's very difficult to predict. So we're working with the Climate Prediction Center and other folks. And that's why when we do our forecast, we try and come up with this ensemble range that cycles through sort of the past 30 years worth of temperature and precipitation data, because we know that there's times where we might be in for a really hot spring and summer, or maybe a cooler spring and summer, and everything in between. So that's where all of our uncertainty comes from, is that future weather, because there's I shouldn't say all of our uncertainty. The vast majority of our uncertainty comes from that future weather, because we just can't say with a lot of certainty out past 10 days or so.
And on that topic a little bit, you've talked about the change in the median or the average. I think there's that 30-year shift that occurred a few years ago. at where we moved our 30-year average from 81 to 11, right, into 91 to 2020.
Right.
How has that impacted either of you in your job, in your forecasting? Does it make any difference if we say it's 103% of average this year? Does it matter what it would have been with the other data set of 30 years?
You know, for us, you know, adding in that additional information was great for our model, because we took more data and we're able to calibrate our model and kind of teach it new things, I guess. But you know, when we're modeling the stream flow amounts, it's really the conditions on the ground. So it's the actual magnitudes of snowpack, the actual magnitudes of precipitation and these other parameters that really impact things. Where the new average has the most impact to us is on our messaging. If we tell, for instance, saying that we're getting 120% of average runoff this year, if we looked at the past 30-year average, maybe that's only 110% of average, just because it was a higher volume that we were using as a reference period. So it's really in the referencing and in the messaging that it's had an impact more than anything.
Yeah, I would concur. It's very much the same thing. It just allows people to put a current season into context. And, you know, we often talk about climate as being defined as kind of a 30-year record of weather. And so it helps us contextualize any given season in our current climate. And so that's all it really does. But in terms of avalanche activity, it's a season by season thing, and it all depends on how the snowpack structure builds up throughout the course of a season. So you could have a year that's 150% of average that's really stable and not a bad avalanche year at all, or it could be a disaster. So deeper snow doesn't mean safer or more dangerous avalanche conditions, nor does thinner snow. But having a new reference point, I think, does help us with messaging, and it does help put a particular season into context.
So the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center plays a really critical role in reservoir operations for Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And you touched on this a little bit when you talk about different groups and organizations that rely on your forecast products. But can you dive into that just a minute? Because I know that a lot of the listeners have seen these headlines of extremely low levels, drought in Powell, historic low reservoirs, and just talk about how your role is so critical as we're moving into this, through this ongoing drought and aridification.
Sure. So tons of people use our forecast, but probably the biggest user of our forecast is the Bureau of Reclamation, and they're the ones that operate Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam and many of the really large reservoirs throughout the Colorado River Basin. So they make their decisions for Lake Powell's operations and Lake Mead's operations based off of a report that they call the 24-month study, which is based off of their hydrologic model. Our forecasts are probably the biggest factor in driving that hydrologic model that Reclamation has. So we provide these forecasts to them, letting them know how much water they have to move around and operate, and they decide how best to operate their reservoirs in response to that amount of water. So yeah, the big forecasts, especially for us, come out in August. That's when they set their operation plans for the upcoming water year. So you'll probably see a bunch of news articles and stories in August, because we'll be issuing that forecast, and they'll be setting their operations for Powell and Mead for water year 2024 based off of those forecasts.
Yeah, and then just a question that's in the chat right now from Will Myers. Could you please expand on what you said about it taking 3 years of average snowpack to refill those reservoirs? I think with the very important caveat that no one uses any water in the basin. That's what you're saying? He said he just missed that one.
Oh yeah, and so I definitely won't take credit for that. That came out of a Newsweek article.
What, an engineer doesn't want to make a generalized statement?
But I think it just speaks to the magnitude of the deficit that the Colorado River Basin is in. So even though we're getting this really great year right now, we're far from out of the woods right now. And I think that's the big takeaway message.
And then Troy Wineland in the chat as well. I think, Brian, maybe this is more directed towards you about the SNOTEL sites. If you saw that one, hold on, I just lost it. He was saying that SNOTEL sites in Blue River Basin, Grizzly, Fremont, Hoosier Pass are much lower than anticipated. And he's guessing that these sites are wind affected. Do you think that that's the case? Because we've had these powerful winds come through lately.
Yeah, typically, I mean, SNOTEL sites are precipitation sites, so they are targeted and located in areas that do ameliorate the impacts from wind effects. But when you're seeing gusts, upwards of 100 miles an hour, like what we saw in the last wind event, no station is immune, even these precip sites down in the trees. Those particular sites that he mentioned were undoubtedly wind affected, just given the wind speeds, but it's also just been drier there. So as I showed in those snow depth maps, those are some of the few stations that are below long-term median, and that's consistent throughout the basin because our easternmost reaches of our mountains have just not gotten the same brunt of the storms as the western stations. I wouldn't discount wind playing in effect because we even saw wind effect in the very deep zones, kind of out where I live, all the way down into the valley bottom. So, but I don't think wind's the main story here. It's just been that they've been missing out on the bulk of the precip from the storm so far.
And Brian, looking at the conditions that we have on the ground right now in our basin, well, I mean, they can vary so much from the directional aspect of every ridge and where that wind was impacted. Can you give some general advice to anyone in the audience who is thinking about doing some backcountry or side country skiing based on what we're seeing on the ground right now as far as safety and planning?
Yeah, there's a big difference in terms of avalanche conditions and the kinds of avalanche you're likely to trigger depending on where you are. So to really make it simple, I showed those purple areas, those deep snowpack zones. So we're talking like portions of the southern San Juan Mountains from Wolf Creek all the way to the Platas, the Grand Mesa, the western reaches of the Elk Range, the Flat Tops, and then the Park Range. In those areas, we're really not worried about more deeply buried weak layers. And most of our concerns are from blowing and drifting storm snow, like what we're seeing right now. The rest of the state has a much thinner snowpack than those areas. And we've got weak layers both in the upper and bottom of the snowpack that are within range of human triggered avalanches. And so in those places, we're warning people to be aware of persistent weak layers. And what that means is you can trigger avalanches from quite a bit of a distance away, or you can even trigger them from below. And those instabilities last weeks and sometimes even months. And so really, because of the variation around the state, we want to get your local avalanche forecast. So just go to colorado.gov/avalanche. We also have a mobile app. You can click on the map for any location you're going in Colorado, or just type in a place name and you'll get a forecast for that particular region because there are variations around the state.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And then Paul, I have one question, and this might be kind of a selfish one, but which rivers should we keep an eye on this year that might have amazing rafting that haven't for a while, perhaps? Are we going to see some runoff like on the Dolores, or what are we thinking up at the Yampa? I mean, if you were a boater, maybe hypothetically, where would you be looking to try to get to?
I was actually just talking about this with some folks in our office, but I think the Yampa River Basin in general is going to be a big hotspot this year. I think we're going to see our highest flows in that region. So for someone like me who is not a very good boater, it might be a little too advanced, but yeah, there's definitely some people in our office that are excited about conditions in the Yampa.
Nice. Let's see, I'm just going to round up real quick, make sure I got all of our questions. Oh, somebody's asking, how do you model for sublimation? And what percentage would you use in a water balance? That question might make more sense to you all than it does perhaps to me.
Well, we don't explicitly model sublimation. There's our model basically has a factor for losses. So it's all kind of lumped into like evapotranspiration. But we don't explicitly model sublimation. Which in some years we've definitely noticed a bit of an over forecast because maybe very windy conditions or something like that has contributed to a lot of sublimation.
And
Awesome.
from a snowpack perspective, not if you get really strong winds that lead to sublimation, those will often appear in the data stream from the higher elevation sites. So you will see snowpack loss appear.
Awesome. Well, Paul and Brian, thank you so much for visiting with us today. I just want to make a final plug for our State of the River series events. I think in the chat, there's a link to those events. We're going to have registrations live for all of them by the end of the week. So if you're interested in these discussions around rivers and what we're doing to help manage water and to help support water users in all the different groups across our counties, these are great ways not just to get information, but to network. We have lots of nonprofits and local organizations. We'll have hydrologists talk about the rivers and the snowpack, and then people who are representing your interests with water in the local regions. So definitely check out our website for those as we move into this season. And thank you all so much for joining us. And again, Brian and Paul, thank you very much for your time.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.